100% of the time, guaranteed. Whereas an endgame build, you're going to have to grind, get lucky. Those aspects aren't guaranteed. The uniques aren't guaranteed. These builds that I've put together in this video are guaranteed. You can get everything you need for these builds 100% of the time. And I've centered these builds around those legendary aspects you can get from dungeons, which of course will be 100% of the time. And I'll go through exactly which dungeon in which zone you can find those legendary aspects, so that these types of builds, which are season starter builds, basically your first character, you don't have gear, these builds will be perfect for that first character that you're choosing to level. I hope you guys enjoy. And first up is the Sorcerer. Now, this may just be the most powerful build in the entire game, easily the highest burst build I have ever seen so far, and no, it does not include Hydra. Now, let's dive into the skills first. Now, we're basically going to be putting together a build that is focused around vulnerability, around being frozen, and around having a barrier and having them being stunned. All of these things are going to cause increased damage, and a lot of it. So, let's begin. First up, Arc Lash. We're getting this because we're going to use this in one of our enchantment slots. The enchantment effect. When you use a cooldown, enemies around you are stunned for half a second. We get huge bonuses when enemies are stunned, and a lot of the lightning skills will cause stuns. So this is a great enchantment effect. We're going to go over to Spark. The reason we're using Spark is this is our primary skill to generate mana. We're going to get Enhanced Spark. Each time it hits its primary target, it's going to hit 3 additional enemies. It will deal 20% increase to a primary target if it doesn't hit those additional enemies. We're also going to get Glinting Spark. It grants 2% increased critical strike chance per 3 seconds, up to 10% increased critical strike chance. Critical strikes will be important for this build. If we move over to the core, we're going to put 1 point into Fireball so that we can have it as the enchantment effect. This is probably the most powerful enchantment effect for the Sorcerer. As you can see in this gameplay footage, anytime someone is killed, they just explode and does a bunch of damage. So this is super powerful. The enchantment effect reads, when you kill an enemy, they explode in a fireball for 50% of its damage. This is awesome. Greatest enchantment ever. Definitely include this pretty much in every build. I just think it's the strongest. When it comes to your core skill, Chain Lightning. And the reason I'm saying Chain Lightning is because it was so strong in the open beta. This does 58.8% of your damage, bounces around. We can upgrade it. Enhanced Chain Lightning. Chain Lightning gains a 3% increased critical strike chance per bounce. Wow. If Chain Lightning bounces off of you, its next hit deals 25% increased damage. Huge bonus, right? Chain Lightning did so much damage in the open beta. We learned in the beta feedback notes from the developers that this ability's damage was reduced, and it was also additionally reduced against bosses. Will this build still be good? I still think so. We could even just switch over to Charged Bolts because this had its damage increased, mana cost decreased, so you could switch over and use Charged Bolts instead of Chain Lightning, but we're just gonna have to see how big the nerf to Chain Lightning was, if it's still viable. Hopefully it still is. Very, very strong skill. Now, we're also gonna get Devastation, maximum mana increased by 9. That's gonna be very helpful for this build. And we're gonna put 3 points into Elemental Dominance, 12% increased damage when you cast above 50 mana. Awesome. Okay, let's move over to the defensive. We have a bunch of defensive skills, very, very strong ones. First of all, Teleport. This is necessary because number 1, gives you Unstoppable. Gotta have Unstoppable in every single build that you put together, and this is your source of Unstoppable. Also helps you get around better. Teleport's cooldown is reduced by half a second per enemy hit, up to 3 seconds. Awesome. And then Mystical Teleport for 4 seconds after teleporting, Crackling Energy hits 2 additional enemies. The way Crackling Energy works, basically, as you use lightning skills, Crackling Energy will appear. You pick it up, and then it's going to zap enemies that are near you and deal damage to them. And you can see on the bar, there's like a little Crackling Energy token sort of that shows how many you have and how many you could have. And yeah, they're pretty good. Over here, we're gonna get Glass Cannon. You deal 18% increased damage, but take 9% more damage. Not a problem because we're also going to get Ice Armor. This is awesome. It's a barrier, and the build has lots of different bonuses when you have a barrier. That's why this is very strong. Barrier of Ice forms around you for 6 seconds, absorbing a percentage of your base life in damage, and while it's active, 10% of the damage you deal is added to the barrier. That is so strong. That's amazing ability. We're gonna get Enhanced Ice Armor. While Ice Armor is active, your mana regeneration is increased by 25%. This is important because while we're above 50 mana, we deal more damage, remember? And then we're gonna get Mystical Ice Armor. Damage against vulnerable enemies contributes 100% more to Ice Armor's barrier. This is big because, again, this is a vulnerable build as well. And we're gonna get that vulnerability from Frost Nova. Unleash a torrent of frost, freezing enemies around you for 2 seconds. Down here we got Enhanced Frost Nova. Killing enemies frozen will reduce its cooldown by 2 seconds, up to 6 seconds per cast. Very nice. Then we're gonna get Mystical Frost Nova. Frost Nova makes enemies vulnerable for 4 seconds, increased to 8 seconds against bosses. That is a key part of this build. Moving over to Conjuration, 1 point into Align the Elements. You're gonna get 5% damage reduction against elites. For each second you haven't taken damage, from 1 up to 50. So you basically get 50% damage reduction with a single point. Amazing until you start taking damage from elites. And then we've got Protection. Using a cooldown grants 30% of your maximum life as a barrier for 5 seconds. That's amazing because we have 4 skills that have cooldowns. We've got all of our defensive skills and our ultimate, and we're just going to get barriers nonstop. This is shocking how good this is. Okay, let's move over to Mastery. This is where we're going to get some of our lightning skills as well. Static Discharge, Lucky Hit, Critical Strikes with shock skills have a 15% chance to form a crackling energy. Remember, you pick those up and they shock people. Invigorating Conduit, upon absorbing crackling energy, you gain 12 mana. Definitely always have your mana high, so this is great. And then finally, Shocking Impact. Every time you stun an enemy, you deal 45% lightning damage to them. Very, very good, because if you remember in the beginning, our enchantment was Lightning Arc. When you use a cooldown, enemies around you are stunned for half a second. Amazing. So that means they're also getting 45% lightning damage done to them every time you use a cooldown. Very, very awesome. I love this interaction with that Arc Lash enchantment. Very, very strong. Okay, let's move on to the ultimate. Unstable Currents. I'm sure you could have guessed it. Lightning surges within you for 10 seconds. Whenever you cast a shock skill, a random core, conjuration, or mastery shock skill is also cast. This is awesome. Just tons of lightning damage. Great ultimate ability. Get the upgrade to increase your attack speed by 25% while it's on. And then you can get crackling energy continually pulses and consumes no charges while this is going on. So that is awesome. It's just going to keep pulsing without you losing charges as this ultimate goes on. So that's sweet. We're also going to get Coursing Currents. Hitting enemies with a shock skill increases your critical strike chance by 3% over and over and over, but it resets upon getting a critical strike. So you're going to have pretty much guaranteed critical strikes with this build. I love it. We're going to get Conduction, 9% movement speed whenever you critically strike with shock skills. Awesome. You're moving around fast. And then finally, Convulsions, really big part of the build here. Lucky Hit, shock skills have a 9% chance to stun enemies for 3 seconds. That's huge. Really just a major part of the build because we want as much stun as possible. So we've got stuns, we've got vulnerable, we've got ways to get barriers. Remember those 3? And over here we've got Veer's Mastery. Close enemies take 10% increased damage from your shock skills and deal 20% less damage to you. Critical strikes increase these bonuses by 25% for 3 seconds. So close enemies means melee range. This is basically a melee range sorceress. Like, you are not afraid to get up in your enemies' faces and use chain lightning on them in melee range, because you're literally going to teleport into them. You're going to use Frost Nova. That's going to freeze them. They're not going to be hurting you. And then you can just deal damage to them, get that 10% increased damage. If you get a crit, that goes up to like 12% or something like that. I don't know. But basically, it's awesome. It's amazing. Tons of increased damage. And now that we've gone through the skills, I can't wait to show you guys the legendary aspects behind this build, because it's amazing what you can put together with just legendary aspects you can find from dungeons. And guys, remember, when it comes to legendary aspects, you want to look at the aspects you can get from dungeons in each zone. They're extremely important because legendaries aren't going to drop like they did in the beta, and these aspects are guaranteed from these dungeons, which means it will be in your best bet to make a build around what is available. And remember, once you get these legendary aspects from dungeons, they'll go into your Codex of Power and can be imprinted on rare items an infinite number of times, meaning as you find better gear, you can continually keep this aspect on your character. Now, when you do find a legendary item, remember that when you extract that legendary power, that can only be done once, so you'll typically want to save those aspects for more endgame gear. And remember too that these aspects we find in dungeons are going to always roll the lowest possible value, so you are going to be replacing these in the endgame. Okay, so let's start with some of the offensive aspects to show you how the skills we chose fit together into this build. So first we have Storm Swell aspect. You deal 11% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while you have a barrier, unlocked by completing Onyx Hold in Dry Steps. This is great because we've got Protection, which gives us a barrier every time we use a defensive cooldown. We've got Ice Armor, which gives us a barrier, and there's actually another aspect that's going to give us a barrier. So we're going to have barriers on pretty much the entire time whenever we choose to activate them. And anytime we use Frost Nova, that's going to make enemies vulnerable, and so that's 20% increased damage plus another 11%. If you put this on a two-hander, that's another 22%. We're now sitting at 42% increased damage to enemies from using one ability. Amazing. Let's look at our Amulet offensive aspect. We've got Aspect of Control. You deal 30% more damage to immobilized, stunned, or frozen enemies, unlocked by completing the Sunken Barbarian library in Kyrgyzstan. Since this is on an amulet, this will be 45% more damage. You could even switch aspect of control with Storm Swell, so this could go up to 60% more damage. We've got stun in the build, we've got freeze in the build. You should absolutely be getting this off all the time so that you're dealing, well, in this case 45, but up to 60% more damage if you put this on the two-hander, because you are going to always be stunning and always be freezing your enemies. Huge damage bonus, absolutely huge. Then we have aspect of retribution. Now basically distant enemies have a chance to be stunned when they hit you. That's great and fine, but more importantly, you deal 30% increased damage to stunned enemies. As if this build couldn't get more increased damage. So when an enemy gets stunned, they're going to have that, you know, assuming they're vulnerable, you know, you've got the 42% increase, you've got the 45% increase. Let's add another 30% increase on top of that. Absolutely insane. We're now at over 100% increased damage. We've now doubled our damage with this. Absolutely insane. I'm losing it here. It's just shocking. Aspect of the Expectant. This is a generic. It's in almost every build that I've been putting together. It's just so good. You use your basic skills, makes your next core skill deal more damage. It's just great. You can basically build up for when you're ready to go fight a boss and just zap them for a bunch of increased damage, up to 50% increased damage. So now we're at like 150% increased damage. You can get this from the Underroot in Skazglen. And finally, our last offensive aspect, we've got Edge Masters. Skills deal up to 24% increased damage based on your available primary resource. For us, it's mana, receiving the maximum when you have full primary resource unlocked by completing Old Stones in Skazglen. This is great because anytime we have over 50 mana, we get bonus damage. So why not just try to always have max mana when you go into a fight so you get this maximum amount of bonus. So this is 24% increased damage. So I think we're almost at 200% increased damage now. So very, very amazing legendary aspects you can find for this build, guaranteed every time you play this game. Absolutely awesome. Now that we went through the offensive aspects, let's look at the resource aspect. So recharging aspect, each time Chain Lightning bounces off of you, gain 4 mana. That's nice because we need to have our mana up. You can get this from Zenith in Fractured Peaks, so you can get that one really early, right when you start the game. Then we've got aspect of Shared Misery. Now we've got freezes, we've got stuns, and we've got vulnerable. Aspect of Shared Misery is going to help us spread those. So when you hit a crowd controlled enemy, there's a 30% chance for that crowd control effect to spread to another unaffected enemy. So those freezes and those stuns can spread. You can get that by completing Oblivion in Hawazar. That one's one of my favorites, honestly. And then finally, our defensive aspects. We've got aspect of Might. Basic skills give you 25% damage reduction for 4 seconds, unlocked by completing Dark Ravine and Dry Steps. Love this generic aspect, so good. And we've got aspect of the Protector. And this is perfect for the build because remember, for this to get that 11% or 22% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, you have to have a barrier. We've got ice armor for barrier, and we've got a protection for barrier, which is whenever you use a defensive skill. But now we also have aspect of the Protector. Damaging an elite enemy grants you a barrier, absorbing damage for 10 seconds. You can get this from the Lost Archives and Fractured Peaks. So another source of getting barrier, so you're dealing with increased damage. This build's absolutely amazing. As you can see in this footage, it just does so much damage with all of the increase bonuses you can get from aspects. And there's ones that are even better than this. However, those you'll have to find from drops. Now, with those legendary aspects out of the way, let's talk about the Paragon board. So this is the starter board. Once you finish that up, you can move on to your next board. I recommend you select the Ceaseless Conduit. Crackling Energy has a 25% chance to not consume a charge when triggered, and Crackling Energy's damage increased by 2% per 20 total intelligence you have. Awesome. I mean, it's a lightning build. You're going to be building up a ton of Crackling Energy. Why not make it more efficient? After you complete that, head on over to the Static Surge Paragon board. Stunning close enemies restores 10 mana. Every time you use a cooldown, it's going to stun everyone in AoE guaranteed because of Arc Lash. Arc Lash Enchantment will always give you stuns, which will always give you mana back, and it's really important that you stay as high mana as possible because of the legendary aspects we chose. We talked about the enchantments, but I'll say it again. We're going to enchant with Fireball. This is the #1 most important enchantment. Get this one first. It increases your damage so much. Highly recommended. Get the Fireball as your first enchantment, and then your second one, Arc Lash, so that whenever you use a cooldown, you cause everyone around you to be stunned, which fits perfectly with the build. And that is the Sorcerer build. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. And next up is the Barbarian. Now, I am super excited for this build. It just fits together so perfectly and is so strong. Look at how fast this barb drops enemies. But before we start, don't forget I'll be making leveling guides to show which builds make the most sense to level with for each of the other classes too. So don't forget to subscribe if you want to see those. We've got Sorceress left and a bunch of other awesome Diablo 4 videos coming after that. Now, if you enjoy slicing and spinning through enemies in a bloody mess, this is the build for you. Let's jump right into the skills. First off, lunging strike. This thing is amazing. You're just like, whoopah! You know, you like lunge forward and just stab them. It's great. This is a ton of damage, and you can make it enhanced lunging strike to deal 30% increased damage and heal you. And then also, more importantly, battle lunging strike. Lunging strike also inflicts 20% bleeding damage over 5 seconds. This build is a bleed build. We've got everything for bleeds. There are so many legendary aspects you can find throughout the world of Sanctuary, guaranteed from dungeons, that really help out a bleed build. Paragon board helps bleed. There is everything you need to make this build amazing. I'm just so hyped for it. Bleed is the way to go. And Whirlwind, particularly Whirlwind, got buffed, as you saw in the last notes. And that's what we're getting in our core skill. Whirlwind rapidly attacks surrounding enemies for 18.2% damage. Enhance Whirlwind, gain 1 Fury each time Whirlwind deals direct damage to an enemy, or 3 Fury against elite enemies. Sick. And then finally, we got this bleed build, Furious Whirlwind. While using a slashing weapon, Whirlwind also inflicts 20% of its base damage as a bleeding damage over 5 seconds. So awesome. We got our primary skill, our basic skill doing bleed. We got our core skill doing bleed. So far, so good. We're also going to get pressure point. Lucky hit. Your core skills have up to a 30% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. Boom. As much as we use Whirlwind, we're going to have chances to apply vulnerable. This is a amazing skill. Highly recommend you check that out. Now that we got those two done, move over to the defensives. Now, I'm not much for defensive playstyles, but this is such a great skill. We got to get it. Rallying Cry. The reason this is really, really good is because 30% move speed, 50% resource regeneration, but also, let's see this over here, Rallying Cry grants you unstoppable while active. This is super important for any type of build, regardless of your class, regardless of the build. You got to have at least one skill that can give you unstoppable. It's super important. You don't want to die while you're CC'd, and unstoppable, when you use it, activate it, this ability, you can get free of crowd control. So if the Blood Bishop grabs you, use this ability, you're free. It's the way to go. Also, Tactical Rallying Cry. It will generate 25 Fury and grant you an additional 50% resource regeneration. So you can get even, your whirlwinds are just going to last so much longer with this particular skill. So it's a great one to get. Okay, let's move on over to the brawling part of the tree. We're going to get War Cry, Bellow a Mighty War Cry, increasing your damage dealt by 15%. Awesome. That's huge. And then it gives you Berserking for 4 seconds. That makes you deal more damage and attack faster. Berserking is amazing. And then we're also going to get Power War Cry. If at least 6 enemies are nearby when you cast War Cry, your damage bonus is increased to 30%. Insane. 30% increased damage when you use War Cry. Absolutely insane. And by the way, it's going to give you Berserking too, so it's like more like what, 45%? Insane. And we're going to get some nice legendary aspects that go with Berserking in this build. So having that Berserking keyword is fantastic. We're also going to get 3 points into Swiftness. You're just going to get a passive 12% movement speed bonus. It's always on. What a great skill just for barbarians. And we're going to get Leap. This is going to help us get around. It's going to help us knock back enemies. It's awesome. It's a positional skill. It's going to be really great. Enhanced Leap. If Leap doesn't damage any enemies, its cooldown is reduced by 4 seconds. So you can kind of just be like a frog, like hop, 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 if you're not hitting any enemies with it. And finally, Power Leap. If it damages at least one enemy, gain 40 Fury. So it's a great way to get some Fury back as you engage in battle and whatnot. Finally, Weapon Mastery. 3 points in Pit Fighter. You deal 9% increased damage to close enemies. They're always going to be close enemies because literally you're a melee character. And you gain 6% distant damage reduction. That's cool. So when someone's shooting like an arrow at you, it's not going to hurt as much. It's not going to hurt your knee as much. No Mercy. You have 9% increased critical strike chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed enemies. This is huge because, as we're going to find out very shortly, this build is always going to have enemies slowed, which opens up a ton of really awesome playstyles. If you guys see my previous videos, you know what I'm about to get into. We've got 3 points in Slaying Strike. You deal 22.5% increased damage against injured enemies. That's awesome. It's basically like when they're below 35% health, they're in like this execute phase, and you can just start dealing some extra damage to them. And now one of the most important points of the entire build, hamstring. Your bleeding effects slow enemies by 10%. Boom, there it is. Now we are applying slows throughout all of our abilities. That's a crowd control effect. It opens up the door for so much combos. It also, of course, makes, what's this one? No Mercy. You're going to get that 9% critical strike chance all the time because they'll be slowed. And then we get 3 points into Cut to the Bone. Your bleeding effects deal 18% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. This is good because, as we got in the beginning, our core skills have Lucky Hit to cause vulnerable. Very, very awesome synergy throughout everything we've gone through so far. So excited about it. We've got Call of the Ancients. In my opinion, this is just like the strongest ultimate. Does so much damage. We'll get Prime Call of the Ancients. While it's active, gain 10% bonus attack speed and 10% increased damage. That's huge. Supreme Call of the Ancients. Each Ancient grants additional power. Korlik's going to give you 10 Fury each time they damage an enemy. Talik is going to slow enemies, and Madoc is going to stun enemies. So very, very cool little bonuses there. We're going to also put 3 points into Heavy Handed. While using two-handed weapons, you deal 15% increased critical strike damage. That's awesome. And finally, when we get to our key passive, we've got Gushing Wounds. When causing an enemy to bleed, you have a chance equal to your critical strike chance to increase the bleed amount by 100% of your critical strike damage bonus. In short, this means that your bleeds can kind of like crit, right? It's a chance equal to your critical strike chance, right? So your bleeds are going to crit essentially, right? To increase the bleed amount by 100% of your critical strike damage bonus. So essentially bleeds can crit. And then when you overpower a bleeding enemy, it's going to cause an explosion that inflicts 11% bleeding damage over 5 seconds. That's awesome. And there is some overpower in this build as well. Every character has a 3% baseline overpower if you did not know that. So there you go. All right, now that we've gone through the skills, let's talk about legendary aspects. This is something I'm very excited about because there are so many that fit into this build, and Barbarians are special in that they have 4 weapons that you can equip 4 different legendary aspects into. Very, very excited about it. And I gotta just remind you guys, again, when it comes to legendary aspects, you want to look at the ones you can get from dungeons, and it's extremely important that you do this because legendary aspects aren't going to drop like they did during the beta, and so it's going to be very rare to actually find a legendary aspect like that outside of the dungeons. And by the way, when you find a legendary aspect, when you extract it, it's going to be sort of a one-time thing. When you imprint it, you can't imprint it more than once. But these legendary aspects that I'm going to go through are going to go into your Codex of Power, and you can imprint them an infinite number of times, which means that you can continue to upgrade your gear as you level. So I just think it's super important to keep that in mind, which is why I chose these specific aspects for leveling. So I just want to start with the offensive ones. They're just so much fun. Let's start with Aspect of the Expectant. This is a generic one. Attacking enemies with a basic skill increases the damage of your next core skill by 5% up to 50%. So as you use Lunging Strike, your next Whirlwind is going to be stronger. Veteran Brawler's Aspect. Each time a core skill deals direct damage to an enemy, your next Charge or Leap deals 15% increased damage up to 225%. That's huge. We have Leap. You're going to be using Whirlwind a lot. So you just like Whirlwind and then you Leap and then you Whirlwind. You know, it's awesome. You're going to get some huge bonus damage. I'm sorry. So the Aspect of the Expectant, you can get that from the Underroot in Skazglen. The Veteran Brawler's Aspect, you can get that from Heretics Asylum in Kyrgyzstan. And then we're going to talk about Aspect of the Dire Whirlwind, right? So Whirlwind's critical strike chance is increased by 5% for each second it is channeled up to 20%. Awesome. We have Whirlwind. We're going to be channeling it for a long time. It's awesome that we're increasing the critical strike chance, which is really good for this build because when you crit, you're going to do an extra bleed damage. This is unlocked by completing Garen Hold in Skazglen. So much stuff in Skazglen. It's crazy. And then finally, our 4th weapon, Earth Striker's Aspect. After swapping weapons 10 times, your next attack will overpower. Remember, that's part of our key passive. Overpower causes that explosion of blood, and it will deal 30% increase overpower damage. You can unlock this by completing Moggen's Works in Hawazar. And then our final offensive aspect is Aspect of Berserk Ripping. Whenever you deal direct damage while berserking, inflict 22% of the base damage dealt as additional bleeding damage over 5 seconds, unlocked by completing Mournfeld in Dry Steppes. There's that Morn Field, something like that. All right, so those are the offensive aspects. As you can see, they fit the build perfectly. You can find all of them in dungeons. Let's talk about some of the resource aspects. Aspect of Unrelenting Fury. Killing an enemy with a core skill refunds 10% of the base Fury cost. Can only happen once per skill cast, right? So unfortunately, not the best, but at least you're getting some Fury back every time you use one of your skills. You can get this by completing the Hallowed Ossuary in Fractured Peaks. So you can get that one very early. The next resource aspect is Aspect of the Umbral. This is probably what you were thinking about once you saw that hamstring ability, that slow. Restore one of your primary resource when you crowd control an enemy, unlocked by completing Champion's Demise and Dry Steps. You're going to be crowd controlling every single enemy you touch. So because this is a bleed build and all of our skills cause bleed, so every time you attack an enemy and then you make them start bleeding, they will be slowed and you will get one Fury back, which is awesome. And we've got even more to go with that. So we got Aspect of Anemia. Lucky hit direct damage against bleeding enemies. Have up to a 31% chance to stun them for 2 seconds. That's awesome. Unlocked by completing Core Dragon Barracks in Fractured Peaks. So this is awesome. Stuns are great. And there's probably tons of synergy there actually as well that I may have even missed, but I believe if you deal increased damage to stunned enemies with another one of these aspects, if I didn't choose it, we'll see though. Aspect of Shared Misery. Lucky hit when you hit a crowd controlled enemy. There is a 30% chance for that crowd control effect to spread to another unaffected enemy, unlocked by completing Oblivion and Hawazar. So if you are, spinning and dealing bleed damage to enemies and they're getting slowed, it's going to basically spread to enemies you haven't even hit yet, which I think is awesome. Basically, it's going to, every time it spreads, you're going to get extra Fury. So it's going to cause your Fury regeneration to basically exceed the rate at which you're even making enemies slowed by making them bleed, which is crazy. It's awesome. Iron Blood aspect. This is our defensive aspect. Gain 2% damage reduction for each nearby bleeding enemy, up to 10%. Very nice. Perfect for our bleed build. Unlocked by completing Forgotten Ruins in Kyrgyzstan. And our other defensive aspect of Might. It's generic. It's in almost every build. Basic skills grant 25% damage reduction for 4 seconds, unlocked by completing Dark Ravine and Dry Steps. Everyone's going to be spamming Dark Ravine. I can see it already. It's in like every build. Okay, and last, our mobility aspect, Wind Striker. We've got a lot of crit in this build. We want lots of crit in this build because bleeds can basically crit in this build. Critical strikes grant 8% movement speed, and it is unlocked by completing Shivta Ruins in Kyrgyzstan. Very, very exciting build. And I do want to say, you probably could get rid of Aspect of Shared Misery and instead get Aspect of Retribution. I'm really happy I did this live. Basically did not plan to show you this, but Aspect of Retribution makes it so that distant enemies have a 15% chance to be stunned for 2 seconds when they hit you, and you deal 30% increased damage to stunned enemies. 30% increased damage to stunned enemies. And you can get this from the Abandoned Mineworks in Kyrgyzstan. This might actually be even better because direct damage against bleeding enemies have a 31% chance to stun them for 2 seconds, and here you deal 30% increased damage to stunned enemies. OMG. That's amazing. I think this is better than Shared Misery because you're going to be putting slows on anyways. So what if it's a little slower? Yeah, I think this is the way to go. This is insane. And then finally, let's talk about the Paragon board. I got something really awesome lined up here. So Paragon board, this is your starter board right here. And then you're going to move up along this way and you're going to choose the Paragon board called Blood Rage. Killing a bleeding enemy has a 12% chance to grant berserking for 5 seconds. This is amazing. This is going to basically make it so you are constantly in a state of berserking, which is huge. It's huge because we get bonuses for being in berserking. Berserking, by the way, is already super strong, but let's see here. When you deal direct damage while berserking, inflict 22% of the base damage dealt as additional bleeding damage. Awesome. And you're going to be in berserking all the time with this. And berserking is already, once again, a big damage percentage increase and attack speed increase. Berserking is super strong. And then you can move on to your next board, which is going to be Hemorrhage, which is, the name of it is kind of a hint. It's perfect for bleed builds. Let's see here. Hemorrhage. Enemies that have been affected by your bleeding for 3 or more seconds take 15% increased damage from you. Insane. Another 15%. This might be one of the builds that I am most excited for. You can get every single thing you need for this build from dungeons guaranteed, no luck required. And when you do get lucky, you can replace some of these, generic ones that aren't that strong. Like, maybe you want to get rid of Iron Blood aspect for something even stronger, something more damage related. There's stuff out there, but what an amazing build, guys. Let me know what you guys think about this build in the comments. I'm super excited for it. And next up is the Rogue. Now, if you enjoy playing a melee build as a rogue, then the Flurry Rogue is for you. This is the build that I chose to play during the open beta, and it was so much fun, especially since you can find a key aspect for this build in the Fractured Peaks, so you can even give this a try during the server slam, see if you like it. I found it to be extremely powerful even before the build was complete, so I can't wait to show you guys this particular build. I know for a fact it's going to be great for leveling. All right, so let's start out looking at the skills. First skill, Invigorating Strike. I like this ability a lot because it increases your energy regeneration by 20%, and then you can also upgrade it to increase that energy regeneration even more, and then you can get it so that if you hit an enemy when you have below 50% energy, it makes them vulnerable. And that's a key theme for this entire build. You're going to be making enemies vulnerable with most of your skills, spreading that vulnerability with Flurry, which we're going to get to, and it does a ton of damage. Again, vulnerable gives you plus 20% damage to that target. So Invigorating Strike, and we move to Fundamental Invigorating Strike. Over in the core skill, we're going to get Flurry. Of course, the namesake of the build, Flurry is going to release a flurry of stabs and strikes, which deals a ton of damage, 84%. It does 4 attacks, right? When we're going to get Enhanced Flurry, which reads, every time Flurry damages a crowd-controlled or vulnerable enemy, you are healed for 1% of your maximum life, up to 12% maximum life per cast. So basically, every time you use it, it could be 12%, depending on how many enemies are around you that are vulnerable and getting hit. And then we have this right here, Improved Flurry. If Flurry hits any vulnerable enemy, it will make all enemies hit by that cast vulnerable for 3 seconds. So basically, you just hit one enemy with Invigorating Strike, get them vulnerable, and then when you cast Flurry, it's just going to spread to everyone that gets hit by that Flurry, which is really, really cool as long as that initial vulnerable monster was hit. So very, very great synergy between those two skills already. Right here we have Stutter Step, critically striking an enemy, grants plus 15% movement speed. That's really great, and the reason we're getting this is because we're also going to get some really nice increased critical strike chance throughout this build, and of course, who doesn't want more critical strikes? Moving over to the agility part of the tree, we're going to get Shadow Step. Again, if you've seen my previous videos, every build needs to have Unstoppable. You don't want to die within a crowd control like a stun or a daze where you can't use your potions. Bosses will grab you like the Blood Bishop, and so Shadow Step is your way to escape that crowd control. It's also really, really great because you can use this to get around terrain. An ability like Trample doesn't let you do this, but if you are at the bottom of a cliff and you see an enemy at the top of the cliff, you can actually Shadow Step to them and basically get around that cliff using that ability. So Shadow Step is really great for that. Really, really great mobility. You can also get Enhanced Shadow Step, which will increase your critical strike chance against them, which is really great. And this also gives you movement speed after you use it. If you get a crit off this, you'll get even more movement speed. And then we get Disciplined Shadow Step, which reduces its cooldown when it damages an enemy you haven't hit with Shadow Step in the last 4 seconds. And so that's really great to reduce your cooldown. It has 2 charges, so very great to just, if you don't Shadow Step the same target twice, then you're going to get that reduced cooldown. That's really cool right there. Weapon Mastery, I think, is a nice added bonus. If you're using a dagger, you're going to get 15% increased damage to healthy enemies. If you're using swords, you'll get 9% increased damage. So nice bonuses there. Moving over to Subterfuge, one of my favorite skills for the rogue is actually Dark Shroud. You surround yourself with 5 protective shadows and you gain 8% damage reduction per active shadow. 5 times 8 is 40, so you get 40% damage reduction. However, every time you take direct damage, you lose a shadow, and so you lose 8% damage reduction. You can refresh this every 20 seconds. You can upgrade this to Enhanced Dark Shroud. Dark Shroud's shadows have a 10% chance to not be consumed. Awesome, that's going to make it last longer. And then we have Countering Dark Shroud. When you have at least 2 active shadows from Dark Shroud, gain 10% critical strike chance. Huge. And so you can see here how the vulnerability part is now coming together with the increased critical strike part of the build. Then we have Exploit down here. You deal 18% increased damage to healthy and injured enemies. That's huge. You become healthy over 80% health and you are injured below 35. So enemies that are in that sweet spot of like 70 through 36 around there, or 84 through 36, you won't have that increased damage. So there you go. When they're at full health and injured, you're going to do extra damage. 18% is a lot, which is awesome. And by the way, usually when you get like an ability off initially, like there's so much burst in this build that you just need to get that first initial hit off and they're already going to be injured. So you're going to have this 18% increased damage quite a bit. Malice says you deal 9% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. We're going to be spreading vulnerability like crazy. Enemies will basically always be vulnerable. And then finally, my favorite part of the rogue tree, we have imbuements. Precise imbuement. Imbued skills gain 15% increased critical strike chance, huge, we're stacking crit. And then Shadow Imbuement, I believe hands down is just the most powerful. I'm gonna have to read it to you, it's just so good. Imbue your weapons with Festering Shadows. Your next 2 imbued skills deal shadow damage and infect enemies for 6 seconds. Infected enemies explode on death, dealing 40% damage to all surrounding enemies. If the infection expires before the enemy dies, it will deal 40% damage to only that enemy. So this is really great because what you use a skill like Flurry, it's going to hit multiple targets. They're all going to get infected, and each one is going to explode on death. And so you can cause this sort of explosive chain reaction where one mob explodes, causing the next one to die and then explode, and so on. And so basically all the mobs just instantly explode. And you're going to see some gameplay footage of that, where you basically use Shadow Imbuement, use Flurry, everything just explodes pretty much instantaneously. Really, really awesome. You can get Enhanced Shadow Imbuement. You have plus 25% increased critical strike chance against injured enemies infected by Shadow Imbuement. Awesome. Then you've got Blended Shadow Imbuement. Shadow Imbuement's primary explosion makes enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. So even more vulnerability in this build. Very, very awesome. Enemies should basically always be vulnerable when you're damaging them. And then finally for the ultimate, I really like Shadow Clone. Basically you're making your character to be really strong. So what if you doubled yourself? The Shadow Clone deals 60% of your damage, but that can be upgraded to do an additional 20%. So that's 80% of your damage. And then it actually also gives you Unstoppable for 5 seconds after casting Shadow Clone. So you have 2 sources of Unstoppable in this build, which you do need because you don't really want to be CC'd. You don't have like a ton of damage reduction other than Dark Shroud, and then that falls off. It gets weaker as you take hits, and then you really have to be getting flurries off with Enhanced Flurry to heal yourself. And that's where the sustain from this build comes, getting those flurries off. And you'll see in this gameplay, like, brings you back up to full health pretty fast. Other abilities I like in the ultimate tree is Adrenaline Rush. While moving, you gain 15% increased energy regeneration. So as you move around, you're getting ready for the next fight. Haste, while you're at or below 50% maximum energy, gain 15% increased movement speed. While below 50% maximum energy, gain 15% increased attack speed. So basically, when you have lots of energy, you're moving faster, you're probably going somewhere, and while you're fighting someone, you're going to have increased attack speed, essentially. Finally, we have Impetus. After moving 15 meters, your next attack deals 21% increased damage. This is perfect for this type of build because basically you're traveling somewhere, you haven't encountered a monster, then when you finally do encounter a monster, you're ready to Shadow Imbue and attack them and get that 21% increased damage and just explode everything. Now, what's really, really cool about Shadow Imbuement and Dark Shroud is that you can actually reduce their cooldown by using it preemptively. And you'll see this basically at the end of combat. Just immediately I use Shadow Imbuement, I immediately use Dark Shroud, and so I can use Shadow Imbuement like the attack, right? And then I can use it again because I began the cooldown before the fight even started. I actually started the cooldown at the end of the last fight. And that's how you should use your imbuements as you play a rogue. Basically, you attack someone, the Shadow Imbuement goes off, use Shadow Imbuement again, and then attack them again. And then as you're traveling to the next pack of monsters, use Shadow Imbuement to start the cooldown on that skill before you even got to the fight, so that way you can basically get 2 in a row. And the same thing goes for Dark Shroud. Once you use it, the cooldown starts refreshing again, even though it's activated on your character. Really, really cool. I don't know if they'll change that in the future, but during the beta, I found that to be a very, very awesome trick. All right, and finally, we have Victimize. Lucky hit, dealing direct damage to a vulnerable enemy, has a 30% chance to cause an explosion, dealing 23% of the original damage to them and surrounding enemies. This is awesome because it's basically like another Shadow Imbuement, but as a passive that is a chance on hit, which basically just gives you more splash. I really, really like this ability because we're stacking vulnerability with this build and just gives you a lot more AoE clearing ability. Now that we've talked about skills, I want to talk about aspects. When it comes to legendary aspects, I suggest you take a look at the aspects you can get from dungeons in each zone. These are extremely important because legendaries aren't going to drop like they did in the open beta, and these aspects are going to be guaranteed from these dungeons, which means it will be in your best bet to make a build around what is available. And remember, once you get these legendary aspects, they'll go into your Codex of Power and can be imprinted on rare items an infinite number of times, meaning it will be with you as you level your character. And finding a legendary item and extracting that aspect is a one-time thing, which is why you should probably save those high-rolled aspects for imprinting on endgame gear. And remember that the aspects you get from dungeons are going to always have the lowest possible value, so these are meant to be replaced in the late game, and also that's why I'm going to read the lowest possible value as we go through these. And again, you can replace these as you progress through leveling. So the first aspect you can get is Ravenous Aspect. Killing a vulnerable enemy gives you 50% increased energy regeneration. You can get this from the Shifting City and Dry Steppes. Again, it's just perfect for our build because we're just stacking vulnerability. It's just a perfect fit. When it comes to Offensive Aspect, Aspect of Might, basic skills grant 25% damage reduction for 4 seconds. You can get this in the Dark Ravine and Dry Steppes. This is just a great aspect in general. Almost every build is going to probably go after this generic one. It's really, really great. Now, this one is specific for rogues. This one is Vengeful Aspect. Lucky Hit, making an enemy vulnerable, has up to a 30% chance to grant 3% increased critical strike chance for 3 seconds, up to 9%. So this is basically 9% extra crit you'll get as you deal damage to vulnerable enemies, which is all the time. And you can get this by completing Inferno in Kyrgyzstan. Really, really good one. Here we have a Defensive Aspect, Aspect of Siphoned Victuals. Lucky Hit, damaging a vulnerable enemy. As you can see, lots of damaging vulnerable enemies. With a core skill, it has up to a 10% chance to drop a healing potion. This is just going to help with your sustain. If you're not getting enough health back from your life drain, then you can just start popping healing potions much more frequently because they're going to be dropping from this aspect. And you can get it from completing Leviathan's Maw in Hauzar. Finally, we can get to the boots. We're going to put a mobility aspect in there called Windstriker's Aspect. Critical strikes grant 8% movement speed for 1 second up to 6 seconds. We have tons of critical strike, increased chance for critical strike in this build, so this is great for it. You can get this from the Shivta Ruins in Kyrgyzstan. On our weapon, we're going to put Aspect of Encircling Blades. This is probably the most important aspect in the build, and you can get this in the Fractured Peaks. I recommend you probably go out of your way to get this early on. Just remember, Fractured Peaks, Forsaken Quarry. Flurry damages enemies in a circle around you and deals 8% increased damage. So the reason this is so good is because Flurry by default is like a frontal cone attack, but this turns it into a circular AoE ability, which just makes it so much better basically for applying shadow imbuement, for applying vulnerability to everything around you. Very, very important aspect. Highly recommend you get this one first. Another one you can put this on your ranged weapon or whatever. Aspect of Unstable Imbuements. When casting an imbuement skill, you trigger an imbued explosion around yourself, applying the imbuement effects and dealing 140 to 275 damage of the same type. Super strong. I believe you can get this one in Kyrgyzstan. Very, very strong legendary offensive aspect. Aspect of Corruption. Your imbuement skill effects have a 20% increased potency against vulnerable enemies. Fits the build perfectly. You get this one in the Dry Steppes. And then Aspect of the Expectant. Generic. If you see in my other videos, your basic skills will make your core skills deal more damage, and you can get this in the Underroot and Skazglen. I think it's just a really strong one. Fits into everyone's rotation, basically. Then finally, we have Aspect of Volatile Shadows. When a Dark Shroud shadow would be removed, you trigger an explosion around yourself, dealing shadow damage, and you can get this from Ancient's Lament and Dry Steppes. So all of these aspects you can get from dungeons. They all fit this build perfectly. Just makes this build, in my opinion, perfect for leveling because you can get all this stuff and make your build so strong, especially with this Fractured Peaks one. It's like you can just start off the game right away, start Flurry Rogue. I just think it's the way to go. All right, now that we talked about that, let's talk about the Paragon board. So let's say you finish your beginner Paragon board. You have to choose which board you want to go to next. I recommend the Exploit Weakness Paragon board because of this legendary node. Whenever you deal damage to a vulnerable enemy, they take 1% increased damage from you for 6 seconds up to 15%. So basically, you're going to get 15% additional damage most of the time after you've done a few hits to someone, especially bosses. So I think this is the best one to go after. There's a lot of other like generic boards you can do too, but I think this one's a perfect fit for this particular build. And then when it comes to the class-specific mechanic, you have 3 options. You've got Preparation combo points or Inner Sight. I found Inner Sight to not be that strong. Basically, once you fill up this Inner Sight gauge by attacking marked targets, it makes all of your resource costs go to 0 for 4 seconds. That's not a very long time. You don't really get that many attacks off for free. I really like combo points. It's going to consistently make your core skills stronger. Flurry, depending on how many combo points, you actually get increased bonus damage and increased attack speed if you just generate those combo points. Preparation, we haven't seen in action, but we believe it's probably going to like reset the cooldown in your ultimate or something like that, which could be strong, definitely. But for now, I would say combo points. And that is the Flurry Rogue. I think this is one of the builds I'm most excited for. It has a ton of potential. Let me know what you guys think about this build in the comments below. And next, we're going to talk about another very viable rogue build, which is the Marksman Rogue. All right, Marksman build time. This build stacks critical strike rating and is pretty darn powerful, uses shadow imbuement as well, and of course we are building this around guaranteed legendary aspects, which we'll get to in that section. Let's start out with the skills. So first up, we want to get Forceful Arrow. I like Forceful Arrow because it does good damage. It can apply vulnerability. This build isn't going to have a ton of vulnerability in it. It's also going to have 15% increased critical strike chance every third cast, which is very nice. And we're going to get Fundamental Forceful Arrow. Forceful Arrow knocks back non-elite enemies if they are close. If they collide with another enemy, they are both knocked down for 1.5 seconds. So that's pretty nice just to give you some distance between you and your enemies. So I like Forceful Arrow as our primary skill. We go over to our core skill, Penetrating Shot. We've got some nice legendary aspects that can go with this. Fires an arrow that pierces through all enemies in a line, dealing 98% damage. Very nice. And we get Enhanced Penetrating Shot to deal 20% increased damage per enemy it pierces. And finally, if Penetrating Shot damages at least 3 enemies, your next Penetrating Shot has a 20% increased critical strike chance. So with all that increased critical strike chance from these two skills already, we are going to get Stutter Step, which critically striking makes you get 15% movement speed for 4 seconds. So that is super nice. And we're going to move on over to the agility part of the tree, and we're just going to pick up Weapon Mastery. This is going to give you a bonus based on weapon type. Bows are going to deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies, and crossbows, so I recommend getting a crossbow in this build, will deal 15% increased critical strike damage. So this is basically a crossbow critical strike build. If you go over to the subterfuge part of the tree, there's a lot of really good stuff in this tree, but I think we're going to have to go with Dark Shroud simply because there are the most legendary aspects that make it even stronger, and it's a really great defensive ability. So basically you get 5 protective shadows. Each one's going to give you 8% baseline damage reduction per shadow, so that's 40% damage reduction. We're going to enhance that to make it so that they have a 10% chance not to be consumed when you get hit. So when you get hit, you lose 1 orb every time you get hit. There's a chance for you to not lose them with this skill. And then there's countering Dark Shroud. When you have at least 2 active shadows from Dark Shroud, gain 10% critical strike chance, which is awesome. So it goes right hand in hand with our critical strike build. And then we've got Exploit. You deal 18% increased damage to healthy and injured enemies. An enemy is healthy when they're over 85% health, I believe, and then below 35% health is injured, and so you deal basically in the extremes, you're going to be doing more damage to them, which is awesome. And there's so much burst in this build that most of the time they're probably going to be in those health ranges anyways. Now in my favorite part of the rogue tree, the imbuements, we're going to pick up Shadow Imbuement. This is going to make your weapons imbued with shadows, and it's going to infect enemies with shadow, causing them to explode on death, dealing 40% damage to all surrounding enemies. This combined with Piercing Arrow is going to cause basically the same thing with Flurry and the other rogue build, just a chain reaction of explosions where mobs are going to instantaneously combust. We're going to get the same 2 enhancements, gain 25% increased critical strike chance against injured enemies infected by Shadow Imbuement, and a blended Shadow Imbuement. Shadow Imbuement's primary explosion makes enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. We're also going to get 1 point into Shadow Crash, 10% chance to stun with shadow damage, and we're going to get 3 points into Consuming Shadows. Each time you kill an enemy with shadow damage, you gain 30 energy. Basically, you're going to get your Penetrating Shot completely refunded essentially by getting this Consuming Shadows skill. We're going to put 3 points into Precision Imbuement. Imbued skills gain 15% increased critical strike chance. As you can see, just so much critical strike chance in this build. And we're going to finish off with Shadow Clone. This is going to be helpful against bosses when you just really need to pump a boss down. You got to have a Shadow Clone with you to help do some damage. It's going to mimic your actions for 15 seconds. It deals 60% of your damage. We can increase that to 80 with Supreme Shadow Clone. And this also gives you Unstoppable for 5 seconds after casting Shadow Clone. And so there's your Unstoppable in this build. When it comes to other ultimate skills, we've got Aftermath. After using an ultimate skill, restore 75 energy. Very, very nice, because think about it. You cast Shadow Clone and you want to basically have full energy ready to start using those core skills so that your Shadow Clone is doing as much damage as possible. Adrenaline Rush while you're moving, 15% increase energy regeneration. Very nice. And then Haste while you're at or above 50% max energy, gain increased move speed. When you're below 50% max energy, gain increased attack speed. So if you think about it, basically as you start fighting, you're going to gain attack speed. And as you are basically full energy, you're going to start moving faster, which means you're basically out of combat. So out of combat, move faster. During combat, attack faster. I like this skill a lot. Then we've got Impetus. After moving 15 meters, your next attack deals 21% increased damage. So that's kind of cool. I mean, I imagine, you're wandering the world of Sanctuary right when you start combat. Every time you're going to do 21% more damage with that initial penetrating shot. What I really like about imbuements and Dark Shroud is that both of these abilities can be used, and then that's going to actually start the cooldown resetting. So you use Dark Shroud while you just finish combat, and by the time you're back in combat, it's pretty much ready to go again. And the same goes for Shadow Imbuement, which essentially allows you to use 2 Shadow Imbuements back to back. Use Shadow Imbuement at the end of a fight, and then the cooldown starts to progress. You use your skill, and you can use it again right after you use that skill because the cooldown already started right at the end of the last fight you had. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully this gameplay footage right here kind of shows you a little bit about how to do that. Really, really strong, these 2 abilities for that reason. And then finally, we finish off with Precision as our key passive. It's going to make critical strikes with Marksman skills grant you precision, and you gain a 4% increased critical strike chance per stack of precision up to a maximum of 20%. Wow, that's crazy. When you reach maximum precision, your next Marksman skill is a guaranteed critical strike that deals 40% increased critical strike damage, then consumes all stacks of precision. So if you don't crit, it's just going to keep raising your chance to crit until you do. Very, very awesome because it's a critical strike build. So very, very cool. And then with all of those skills basically mapped out, let's move over and talk about legendary aspects. So these legendary aspects are ones that you can find in dungeons. And I think it's very important that you take a look at the aspects you can get from dungeons in each zone. They're extremely important because legendaries aren't going to drop like they did in the beta. And these aspects are going to be guaranteed from these dungeons, which means it will be in your best bet to make a build around what is available, and that is what we did here. And remember, once you get these legendary aspects, they're going to go into your Codex of Power and can be imprinted on rare items an infinite number of times, meaning it will be with you the entire time as you level your character. Finding a legendary item and extracting that aspect is a one-time thing though, which is why you should save those high-rolled aspects for imprinting on endgame gear. And remember too that the legendary aspects that we're going to get here from clearing dungeons are always going to roll the lowest possible roll, so they are meant to be replaced at some point. Okay, let's start with the Helm. Energizing aspect, damaging an elite enemy with a basic skill generates 5 energy, and you can get this from the Sanguine Chapel and Fractured Peaks. I think it's a good one. It's just going to help with your sustain to keep, generating energy and using penetrating shot. When it comes to your chest piece, aspect of might, basic skills get 25% damage reduction for 4 seconds. Very strong generic. Again, I think almost every build should probably get this. Unlocked by completing the Dark Ravine in Dry Steppes. Aspect of volatile shadows. This is on your gloves. When a Dark Shroud shadow would be removed, you trigger an explosion around yourself dealing shadow damage, and it's unlocked from completing Ancient's Lament in Dry Steppes. This is good because we're getting Dark Shroud, and if someone melees you, they're going to basically take like Thorns damage, and this is actually probably way more than Thorns would ever do. So very, very nice. We're also going to get an Enshrouding aspect. This one I like a lot. Gain a free Dark Shroud shadow every 3 seconds when standing still. Each Dark Shroud shadow grants 2% increased damage reduction. This is really strong because it's sort of multiplicative in power. You get 5 Dark Shrouds, right? And if each one grants 2% more damage reduction, this is already a 10% increased damage reduction built into this aspect. Very, very strong. Not only that, as you upgrade the skill, it goes from 8% up to like 10. So if you get 2 more each damage reduction, I mean, that is pretty crazy. You can get a lot. You can get like, 12 times 5, 60. You get up to 60% damage reduction if you put 5 points into Enshrouding aspect, which basically the more points you put into Enshrouding aspect, the more you're going to get out of this aspect. So really, really cool. And you can get this from completing Goa Ruins in Hauzar. Definitely one I'm looking forward to picking up. And then for our mobility aspect, the one we put in our boots, critical strikes grant 8% movement speed. Basically, every time you make a critical strike build, makes sense to get Windstriker's aspect for that move speed. And also because you have Stutter Step as well, so you're just getting even more movement speed. And you can get this from completing Shift to Ruins in Kyrgyzstan. When it comes to our weapon, this is a very fun one. We've got aspect of arrow storms. Lucky hit, your marksman skills have a 10% chance to create an arrow storm at the enemy's location, dealing a bunch of physical damage over 3 seconds. You can have up to 5 active arrow storms, unlocked by completing Howling Warren in Skazglen. Definitely go out of your way to get that one. In our other weapon, we're going to get Trick Shot aspect. Whenever penetrating shot damages an enemy, 2 additional arrows split off to either side. These side arrows deal 30% 30% of penetrating shots base damage and do not split. You can get this from completing Bastion of Faith and Hawazar. This is also a very strong one, especially because you're going to Shadow Imbue, just going to help you with that AoE damage. When it comes to the rings, we're going to put Aspect of Unstable Imbuements. When casting an imbuement skill, you trigger an imbued explosion around yourself, applying the imbuement effects and dealing a bunch of damage of the same type, so that's Shadow. This is found in Dry Steppes. I like this one a lot because basically you're probably going to have a lot of monsters running at you. You're probably going to want that explosion, and you can activate this basically when you're surrounded by enemies, even to do some damage right in front of you. So I actually like this one a lot. It's quite a bit of shadow damage too. And that shadow damage, if you kill a monster, that's going to give you energy back too. So there's a lot of synergy there within the build. In the other ring, we're going to put Aspect of the Expectant. This is a generic aspect that I like a lot. Attacking enemies with basic skills will make the next core skill you deal damage with do more damage, up to 50%. Very strong. And you can get this in the Underroot in Skazglen. It's generic. I say, a lot of builds probably should put this in their character. Really, really strong. Then finally, in our amulet, we'll put Aspect of Inner Calm. Deal 3% increased damage for each second you stand still, up to 30%. So the way I imagine this build going is, I would say once you are fighting a group of mobs, stand still, and the more you stand still and just use your ranged attacks, you're just going to deal more damage over time. You're going to generate free Dark Shrouds over time, so you can kind of stand your ground in that respect. And then you can use your Shadow Imbuement if anyone's in melee range with you, and that's just going to kill them. So this is kind of a build where you choose a spot on the screen, you kind of stand still as you deal a bunch of damage, and thanks to Enshrouding Aspect, you're going to, every 3 seconds, gain even more damage reduction, assuming you're not getting hit too much. So this is actually kind of cool. I like the whole standing still kind of theme with this, because you're a ranged character, you can pull it off. But yeah, those are the aspects that I think are a great choice for the Critical Strike Marksman Rogue. All right, and when it comes to your Paragon board, the board I like to go with this Marksman build is the Eldritch Bounty node. When you attack with an imbued skill, you gain 20% resistance and 20% increased damage for that imbuement's element for 6 seconds. The reason I like this is because really the whole build is based around Shadow Imbuement, basically exploding everything on your screen instantaneously, and this will basically ensure that that continues to happen with that 20% increased damage. Really, really strong. And when it comes to your class-specific mechanic, I recommend going with the combo points. I found that the Inner Sight wasn't super powerful, and we weren't able to test Preparation, but it sounds like it'll reset your ultimate skill. That one might be good, but we haven't been able to test it, so we don't know for sure, but I definitely like combo points more than Inner Sight. And that is your Marksmanship Rogue. And next up is the Druid. If you want to play as a werewolf and a werebear, this is the build for you. Let's start out by talking about the abilities loadout for when you just start playing. Now, I like to go with Claw because Claw is much better than Maul. Maul is more of a Fortify generation ability, whereas Claw is going to be doing much more damage. See, 28% damage. This does 20. You can also get Enhanced Claw. I always find going for the enhancements is so much better than, just leveling it up. So really you want to go something like this. You don't want, an additional point into the primary skill doesn't really do much for you. It's 2% more damage versus 10% attack speed, right? At that point, I love to get Pulverize. Pulverize is just a really strong AoE ability. You've got Claw for single target, Pulverize for multi-target, and then Enhanced Pulverize is really strong. So I'll go and get that ability as well. And then you can actually go back up and get Wild Claw. Gives you a 10% chance to attack twice. We're going to change this as we unlock like Wrath tier lower on, but we're going to get to that later. I also like to get Shred for single target and Enhanced Shred as well as Primal Shred. So this is sort of like an early loadout. You can also get Blood Howl if you need health, but really what I've found is that Druid just needs to max out their damage as much as possible early on. So I'm going to get 1 point in Heart of the Wild and 3 points into Wild Impulses. And the reason we do that is because Wild Impulses makes your core skills cost 15% more spirit, but deal 30% increased damage, which is huge. So you definitely want to get that as soon as possible. And then I really don't like any of the companion skills. We're going to have to see, because I know they buffed them significantly. We're going to see if it's much better. While you're leveling though, it doesn't hurt to actually get some of these if it actually does increase your damage, right? What's going to be better? Do you want 3% more crit, or do you literally want a Vine Creeper that does 30% weapon damage? It's an extra cooldown, right? So I would probably go ahead and get Vine Creeper, and you can actually stick with Vine Creeper with this build we're going, so it's not a terrible skill. You can even get Enhanced Vine Creeper and Brutal Vine Creeper, which will increase your critical strike chance by 20% against enemies strangled by Vine Creeper. And this whole build is really based on critical strike chance, so you definitely do want to get Predatory Instinct. And then we finally unlocked the Wrath part of the tree. And in the Wrath part of the tree, you can get Trample, which is going to be a very important skill for us because it gives you Unstoppable. Unstoppable is super important against bosses like the Blood Bishop, who is going to grab you, and you need to be able to get out of that CC as fast as possible. But what's really important as well is Rabies. That's going to give you a nice 28% weapon damage and 53 poison damage spreading to all enemies around you. And then 1 point into Neurotoxin to unlock Envenom. 3 points into that. Poisoned enemies take 30% additional critical strike damage. We also want Toxic Claws. Critical strikes with Werewolf skills deal 22.5% of their base damage as poisoning damage over 4 seconds. So anytime you crit, an enemy gets poisoned. Whenever a poisoned enemy takes a crit, they take 30% additional critical strike damage. So we're finally starting to see some damage come through here. And now that this build is based off Envenom, we're going to start switching around our skills. So Primal Shred we no longer want. We want Raging Shred. Shred's third combo attack is larger and applies an additional 51% poisoning damage over 5 seconds. We also want to switch from Wild Claw to Fierce Claw. Claw now applies 10% poisoning damage over 6 seconds. See how we're sort of switching to an Envenom type build, right? We already have the Vine Creeper, which will cause poison damage. And then also when you activate it, it does AoE poison damage for 30% damage. And then it also increases your critical strike chance by 20% for 2 seconds. So lots and lots of synergy all across the board here. And when it comes to ultimates, I really like Petrify a lot for this build. Read this text right here. Against bosses, the critical strike damage bonus is increased to 50% and its duration is increased to 25%. So Petrify is like a boss slaying ability. I remember back to the open beta and Druids just kind of took forever to kill bosses. Well, Petrify is the answer. What ultimate lasts 25 seconds? Only Petrify. You don't really need to get these, but you can. These extra bonuses, Prime, Petrify, and Supreme, but you don't really need them. One thing I think is really important though in this part of the tree is Quick Shift. When a shapeshifting skill transforms you into a different form, it deals 15% increased damage when you put 3 points into it. So anytime you use Trample when you're a human or a wolf, that will do 15% more damage. If you use Rabies while you're a wolf or while you're a bear, right after Trample, let's say, that will do 15% more damage. All of these abilities are going to get a bonus. So you kind of want to weave your abilities, like use a werewolf skill, then use a werebear skill. And every time you switch, it's going to do 15% increased damage. So it's in your best interest to claw and then pulverize and then shred from being a bear and then go trample and then go back to shred, something like that. And you can in fact get this right here, Savage Trample, which makes your trample grant 20 spirit. Now, when it comes to Keystone passive, we actually need a few more points and other things before we get that. So I'm going to go ahead and put more into Predatory Instinct. Critical strike chance against close enemies is increased by 9%. Since this is all in a critical strike heavy build, it's absolutely worth it to get that. We can finally get our Keystone passive. I like Bestial Rampage a lot. After being a werewolf for 2.5 seconds, you gain 20% attack speed. After being a werebear for 2.5 seconds, gain 20% increased damage. You basically can get both of these since we're going to be shifting between the two, and 2.5 seconds isn't that long. You can easily just, get that buff and then switch to your other form, go back to normal. You could also get Lupin Ferocity because we are such a critical strike heavy build. So that is absolutely an option as well. Now, I think that this build right here is extremely solid and you can just max out points as you see fit. You can absolutely just max out Rabies. You can also get enhanced Rabies for extra poison damage. You can max out Vine Creeper. I think Vine Creeper is pretty strong with this build. We don't use any of these defensives. We don't actually need any of them. Now, I do realize there's 7 skills in this ability loadout. So basically at this point, just decide, like, I would probably not use Petrify unless we're approaching a boss fight. I would choose Petrify over Vine Creeper. And then once we're back in the open world and we're not fighting bosses, bring Vine Creeper back. I just think Petrify is a great ultimate for defeating bosses. But otherwise, Druid ultimates aren't super strong. I know they got their cooldowns reduced because I think most players realize the Druid's ultimate aren't too strong. But this is the ability loadout I would go with. Just being able to weave between Werebear and Werewolf as you're leveling. And you're going to see why this is really important once we get to the legendary aspects portion right now. When it comes to legendary aspects, I recommend you take a look at the aspects you can get from dungeons in each zone. These are extremely important because legendaries aren't going to drop like they did in the beta. And these aspects are guaranteed from these dungeons, which means it will be your best bet to make a build around what is available rather than what you might get from a drop. And remember, once you get these legendary aspects, they go into your Codex of Power and can be imprinted on rare items an infinite number of times, meaning it will be with you as you level your character. Finding a legendary item and extracting that aspect is a one-time thing, which is why you should save those high-rolled aspects for imprinting on endgame gear. Remember too that legendary aspects that you earn from clearing dungeons will always roll the lowest possible value, so these are meant to be replaced in the end game. Now in this section we're going to go zone by zone and show you exactly which aspects to go after for this shape-shifting druid build. Now first up, Fractured Peaks, you're going to want to go after Storm Claws aspect. Critical strikes with Shred deal 20% of the damage dealt as lightning damage to the target and surrounding enemies. This is strong because once again we're going with a Shred build, and we definitely want to stack Critical Strike as much as possible. You can get this in Anika's Claim in Fractured Peaks. This is great because once again we're stacking crit, and this also makes Shred get a little bit more AoE, and we need more AoE with this build because Shred is a little more single target and you aren't always going to be using Pulverize. I recommend using Pulverize every 10 seconds so that your next Pulverize will overpower every 10 seconds while you remain healthy. So what I like about Pulverize is when it overpowers, it almost one-shots everything. So I don't recommend spamming it. I just recommend using it every 10 seconds when it's a guaranteed overpower. Every other time, just probably use Shred. Unless we get to another aspect of the Changeling's Debt, which we'll get to a little bit later. Another great aspect in Fractured Peaks is the aspect of the Unsatiated. After killing an enemy with Shred, your next Werewolf skill generates 20% more spirit and deals 20% increased damage, and you can get this from the Tormented Ruins in Fractured Peaks. Now when you kill a monster with Shred, your next ability should be something powerful. Maybe it should be Rabies, so that your Rabies does more damage because it's going to do 20% more damage, or maybe you want it to be another Shred. Or one thing I saw that was really strong is actually use it on Lacerates. Your ultimate is dealing 20% increased damage. Whatever it is, just make sure you try to focus on making the last ability you use on a monster Shred so that your next ability, that's a Werewolf skill, will deal 20% more damage. Really, really nice legendary you can get throughout Fractured Peaks and then have that forever. Another cool one, which is actually generic, is from Skazglen. Moving on to Skazglen, attacking enemies with basic skill increases the damage of your next core skill by 5% up to 50%. You can find this in the Underroot in Skazglen. This naturally fits into our rotation of using basic skills to get spirit and then use a core skill. So this is a great ability to help your core skills deal more damage, and that's Pulverize and Shred. Moving on to Hawazar, we can get a defensive aspect called Vigorous aspect, gain 10% damage reduction while shapeshifted into a wolf. Most skills are Werewolf in this build. You're going to be using Claw, you're going to be using Shred, Rabies, and so on. And so you're going to be probably a Werewolf most of the time. Get a nice 10% damage reduction there, guaranteed from Hawazar. In the Dry Steppes, there's a generic legendary aspect called Rapid aspect. Basic skills gain 23% attack speed. This is great because faster attacks mean more spirit generation, more damage, and you can apply poison more quickly because you have Fierce Claw, which applies poison damage. And then when we move to Kyrgyzstan, we can get two really good ones, I think, actually. Windstriker's aspect, which makes critical strikes grant 8% movement speed. You can get that to Shiv to Ruins. Crit stacking within this build means that we're going to be gaining move speed pretty much all the time. And then one of the most powerful, I believe, that we can always get, which is so fantastic, is Aspect of the Changeling's Debt. Damaging a poisoned enemy with a Werebear skill will instantly deal 120% of the poisoning damage and consume the poisoning. You can get this in the Conclave in Kyrgyzstan. Since we're stacking poison, this will be a strong follow-up to use after Rabies, after you use Fierce Claw or a Toxic Claw proc on a single target. You can also use this right after you activate your Vine Creeper to strangulate and deal 30% weapon damage as poisoning. That 30% gets amplified by 120% when you use something like Pulverize or Trample, which will then consume that poisoning and deal that damage. This is going to be very strong. I imagine this is going to be like just really a huge increase in your AoE clearing ability. So those are all the aspects you can find every single time, guaranteed from dungeons throughout the world of Sanctuary. Now let's talk a little bit about the Paragon board. Now the number one Paragon board that I recommend you go after with this build is the Heightened Malice Paragon board. The Heightened Malice Paragon board, while there are 3 or more poisoned enemies nearby, you deal 45% increased damage. Poison comes from Toxic Claws, Fierce Claw, Rabies, and also Vine Creeper. If you're lucky, you should also try to get Andariel's Visage, which is a unique which causes AoE poison damage on hit, but there's a proc chance to do that, which is amazing for this build, and you're going to be constantly getting that increased poison damage, which is really, really awesome. And lastly, let's talk a little bit about Spirit Boons for this leveling build. So at level 15, you start your Druid quest, and you can start unlocking these Spirit Boons. Make sure to collect Spirit offerings to get your Spirit Boons, and with this build, we're going to specialize with the Eagle Spirit to get an extra boon. So when it comes to the Deer Spirit Boon, I like Gift of the Stag. You get plus 10 max Spirit. That can help a lot because, you know, when you're generating lots of Spirit spirit. You don't want to generate more than you have. This increases your max. You actually are able to get 3 pulverizes off instead of just 2 when your max spirit is increased. Also, the 2 eagle skills are Scythe Talons, which give 5% crit. Again, this is a crit stacking build. And Avian Wrath, which is plus 30% critical strike damage. You can see the synergy there is great. And then when it comes to the snake, Masochistic, critical strikes heal for 3% max life. So that's going to give you great sustainability. That's why we don't really need a defensive skill. You're just constantly healing as you get crits. And then finally, when it comes to the wolf, I really like Energize, which is lucky hit, dealing damage has a 15% chance to restore 10 spirit. This is really strong, I feel, but you could also, in order to spread your poisons more rapidly and get the 20% increased critical strike chance from Brutal Vine Creeper more often, you could also go with Pack Leader, which is lucky hit. Critical strikes have up to a 20% chance to reset the cooldowns of your companion skills. So that's that Vine Creeper. And again, that's really strong since it's a poison-based build. So I think Pack Leader is very, very viable as well. And that is the build for the Shapeshifter Druid for leveling. And it's going to be, what's great about it is that these aspects are guaranteed. You can go through this consistently every time without having to depend on luck. Next, we're going to talk about another super viable build, which I actually believe may be the best for leveling for a Druid out of all the 3 builds, and that is the Earthen Druid. And don't forget, I'll be making leveling guides to show which builds make the most sense to level with for each of the other classes too. So don't forget to subscribe if you want to see those, along with more awesome Diablo 4 videos. All right, if you are a huge fan of the earth skills, well, I have great news for you. Out of all of the leveling builds that are viable for a druid, in my opinion, I think the earth druid actually has the most aspects that are guaranteed through dungeons that are going to make your build so strong. Honestly, looking at all 3 of them, I really think earth is probably the best way to go for leveling a druid. So let's look at some of the earth skills to start out with. We've got Earth Spike, we've got Enhanced Earth Spike. This is going to give you a 10% chance to stun with your Earth Spike, and then we can finally unlock our Spirit skill, and we're going to get Landslide. We can then get Enhanced Landslide, which after Landslide damages enemies 4 times. The next hit will immobilize enemies for 3 seconds. So that's very strong. And then of course we want to get Heart of the Wild and Wild Impulses, which cause your core skills to cost 15% more spirit, but deal 30% more damage. So that means Landslide is going to be doing so much more damage. What's great about immobilizing an enemy every 4 times is Primal Landslide. You're definitely going to want to get this because when you immobilize or stun an enemy, you gain a Terra Mote. Each enemy hit by Landslide consumes a Terra Mote, and that gives you a guaranteed critical strike with 40% critical strike damage, and bosses always have a 10% chance to grant a Terra Mote when hit. So it's really great synergy with Enhanced Terra Mote causing immobilizations. Definitely want to get that. And we also love that Wild Impulses for that 30% increased damage to Landslide. Moving along, what I really like to get is Earthen Bulwark, and then you have to get Enhanced Earthen Bulwark in order to get Unstoppable. This will give Earthen Bulwark Unstoppable by getting this skill right here. You can also get Innate Earthen Bulwark, which causes a rock shrapnel to fire out when Earthen Bulwark is destroyed or expires, dealing 30% weapon damage to surrounding enemies, and the damage is increased by barrier bonuses. So if your barrier gets stronger, it's going to do more damage, which by the way, the barrier is going to get stronger. Now, what's amazing about nature magic with the druid is that there's actually something really great in the companion skill tree, which is Nature's Reach. Deal 3%, that goes up to 9 with 3 points, 9% increased damage to distant enemies. Double this bonus if they are slowed, stunned, immobilized, or knocked back. Now I'm saying it like that because it's super important. There is aspects that are going to blow your mind with this build that are just so strong, and it's crazy that it's guaranteed every time you play this game. So very strong Nature's Reach. That's going to be basically 18% increased damage all the time, and we're going to show you exactly why that's possible. Now, of course, we don't have enough to unlock Wrath down here yet, so what you can do is start leveling up different abilities, so you can put more points into Earth Spike. You can actually also get Fierce Earth Spike, which is going to cause Fortify. Now, believe it or not, Fortify is going to be used in this build, so you absolutely do want to start generating some Fortify with your abilities. Okay, now that we've unlocked Wrath, you want to get Boulder. Boulder is going to do some very nice damage, and then Enhanced Boulder. When Boulder reaches the end of its path, enemies hit are slowed for 30% for 3 seconds if boulder overpowered. Enemies are stunned for 4 seconds instead. We definitely want that. And then natural boulder, while you have any fortify, boulder has 20% increased critical strike chance. And so that's why we want to build up fortify with some of our different skills. And so that's why we actually are going to get some of these down here. Crushing earth. Earth skills deal 15% increased damage to slowed, stunned, immobilized, or knockback enemies. Again, this is going to be literally every enemy as you see later on, and that's just going to be a flat 15% increased damage, which is amazing. Then we also want Stone Guard. When you fortify over 50% of your life, earth skills deal 12% increased damage. Another reason we want fortify. And then critical strikes with earth skills fortify you for 6.6 base life. You're going to be getting lots of crits when you get these guaranteed crits from the Terra motes, when you get increased critical strike chance from being fortified with boulder, and so on. And now we can finally unlock Petrify. This gives you increased critical strike damage and also stuns enemies. And of course, stuns are very strong as we know. And then we can also get these two over here. I'm going to make Petrify last longer and cause enemies slain by Petrify give you Spirit, which is very, very nice. Now at this point, we can upgrade Boulder again so we can unlock it. Now I really, really like Earth and Might. Lucky hit, damaging enemies with earth skills have a 5% chance to restore all of your spirit and cause your attacks to be guaranteed critical strikes for 5 seconds. That is huge because we want those critical strikes for all those added bonuses, increased attack damage from critical strikes, etc. Very, very strong. So this is your abilities loadout. What you can also get, because we actually only have, let's see, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Only 5 abilities, right? Well, there's actually an aspect that makes Pulverize an earth skill, so you can absolutely get Pulverize as your 6th skill. Pulverize, when it overpowers, is very, very strong, so that could absolutely be worth it. Now, let's talk a little bit about aspects. This is really, really exciting. There are a ton of aspects for an Earth Druid. However, none of them are in Fractured Peaks, and most of them are actually in Skazglen. So head to Skazglen at level 15 for your Druid quest, which is you're going to be going there anyways, and you're going to spend a good amount of time there collecting these legendary aspects from the dungeons there. Now the first one that you can get from Skazglen that I recommend you get is the Cragstone aspect. Earth skills deal 40% more critical strike damage to crowd controlled enemies. Very, very strong. And then the reason that's going to be incredibly strong is aspect of Quicksand. Damage from earth skills slow enemies hit by 25% for 5 seconds. You can find this in Feral's Den in Skazglen. This aspect is really the most important for this build. And the reason for that is because there are so many things that benefit from you crowd controlling enemies. Right here, Nature's Reach. 9% increased damage to distant enemies. Double this bonus if they are also slowed, stunned, immobilized, or knocked back. They're always going to be that because aspect of the Quicksand makes any damage from earth skills slow enemies by 25%. And there's even more. I mean, honestly, I can't even keep track of all of them. Here's another one. Crushing Earth. Earth skills deal 15% increased damage to slowed, stunned, immobilized, or knocked back enemies. So you're getting 15% increased damage just by this right here, and you're getting 18% increased damage right here. I mean, Earth skills are getting huge damage bonuses, not to mention, don't forget Crash Stone aspect. Earth skills deal 40% more critical strike damage to crowd controlled enemies, and it doesn't end there. We're going to keep going through these aspects, and you're going to see some crazy synergies. So we've got Ballistic aspect in Skazglen as well. When you have Fortify, your earth skills gain +2 ranks. You can get this in the Whispering Pines in Skazglen. That's really strong because, of course, we are going to have Fortify whenever you use Earth Spike. You can also, whenever you get a critical strike, you're going to fortify. So there you go. Earth and Shield will fortify. Safeguard, which we talked about, is also going to fortify with those crits. Aspect of the Expectant is a generic that I like a lot. Attacking enemies with a basic skill increases the damage of your next core skill cast by up to 50%. Get that in the Underroot. Moving on to the Dry Steppes, there's Aspect of Retaliation. Your core skills deal up to 20% increased damage based on your amount of Fortify. You don't have to get this, it's generic, but you're going to be generating Fortify anyways, so it's still good. One thing I really like is Aspect of Mending Stone. The duration of Earthen Bulwark is increased by 6 seconds. In addition, killing an enemy with Earth skills replenishes replenishes 25 of your active Earthen Bulwark's barrier, sealed archives in dry steppes. So this is strong because when your Earthen Bulwark explodes, it's going to be even stronger because you are replenishing it as you slay enemies. And then finally, aspect of the Umbral, restore 1 to 4 of your primary resource when you crowd control an enemy. Every single Earth skill is crowd controlling an enemy, and so you're constantly generating spirit just by attacking with any ability. So that's kind of cool as well. And you can get that from Champion's Demise in the dry steppes. Moving on to Hawazar, aspect of the Ursian Horror, Pulverize is now an Earth skill. After casting Pulverize, tectonic spikes continue to deal 175 damage over 2 seconds. So there you go. You can add that 6th skill to the Earth build. You can start using Pulverize, which can be very strong. And you can get that from Belfry, Zakara, and Hawazar. And then finally, we have aspect of Shared Misery. Lucky hit, when you hit a crowd controlled enemy, there's a 30% chance that the crowd control effect will spread to another unaffected enemy. The reason this is strong is, you're not going to need to spread the slow because slow is going to be on every enemy, but your stuff also has a chance to stun, and this will give you a chance to stun enemies, and then whenever you deal damage to those stunned enemies, it can spread that stun to other enemies, which is very, very good because when they're stunned, they can't be hitting you. So it's pretty nice, and there are bonuses when an enemy's stunned as well. Then finally, in Kyrgyzstan, we have aspect of Retribution. Distant enemies have a 15% chance to be stunned for 2 seconds when they hit you, so there's more stun right there, and you deal 30% increased damage to stunned enemies. So there's even more synergy with dealing damage to stunned enemies and slowed enemies. I mean, it's absolutely insane. And you can get that from the Abandoned Mineworks in Kyrgyzstan. The 3 skills that you have that can stun an enemy are Raging Pulverize, which you can get, Enhanced Boulder, and of course, don't forget, Petrify, which is your ultimate skill, stuns everything, guaranteed. So lots and lots of great synergies here from slows, from stuns, from just skills, abilities. It's just absolutely crazy how strong Earth Druid is, and you can get all of these guaranteed every single time from dungeons. Now, the Paragon board you're going to go after while you're leveling. Once you hit level 50, you unlock the Paragon board. I recommend going for the Earthen Devastation Paragon board. The legendary node reads, your Earth skills deal 30% increased damage to enemies afflicted by crowd control. As if there wasn't enough already. You can see aspect of the Quicksand, once again, is such a key aspect for this build, making this legendary node provide a 30% increased damage bonus for all of your Earth skills. I mean, it's really insane. I really feel like Earth Druid is probably the absolute best for leveling because you just get all of these things without having to get lucky. So absolutely amazing. And then once you finish that Paragon board, you can even head over to the Constricting Tendrils Paragon board. This gives you lucky hit nature magic skills, have up to a 15% chance to entangle the enemy with vines, immobilizing them for 2 seconds, and poisoning them for 120% of the base damage dealt over 4 seconds. So there's more immobilized to go with your slows and to go with your stuns. Very, very great. Okay, let's talk about spirit boons. I like Deer, Gift of the Stag, gives you plus 10 max spirit. When it comes to Eagle, Avian Wrath, 30% increased critical strike damage. The reason you don't really need to increase critical strike chance here is because Terra Motes will guarantee critical strikes. You've got a ton of stuff that can guarantee your critical strikes, so you don't actually need to increase your crit chance really with this build. When it comes to Snake, you absolutely want Obsidian Slam. Every 10th Earth skill overpowers. This is super strong because Overpower does a ton of damage. When Boulder overpowers, it stuns. When Pulverize overpowers, it stuns as well. There's just so much benefit when you get Overpower, and of course it does a ton of damage, especially since you have Fortify in this build. I also like to get Calm Before the Storm, which is another Snake spirit boon. Calm Before the Storm makes it so that your nature skills have a 15% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate skill by 2 seconds. Petrify is the strongest ultimate out of all of the Druid ones, if you ask me, so you absolutely want to be able to use that as often as you can, since it also applies a stun and 25 to 50% increased critical strike damage depending on if it's a normal monster or a boss. So very, very cool. And then finally, the Wolf Spirit boon of Calamity, which extends the duration of ultimate skills by 25%. Petrify, once again, getting that synergy, making it last longer, have a lower cooldown, really just banking on Petrify to be active as often as possible. And that is the Earth Druid leveling build, one of the strongest, if not the strongest in my opinion, for just leveling a Druid. Maybe it won't be the best end game, but it looks so strong because you can get all of this stuff guaranteed every time you level a Druid. Might be the one that I go with. And that is the Earth Druid. Next up, we're going to talk about the Storm Druid. Now, out of all of the primary skills, in my opinion, the best one is Storm Strike. So we're going to go with Storm Strike because it is a storm skill. We're going to go ahead and get Enhanced Storm Strike. By the way, the reason Storm Strike is so good, you get 25% damage reduction for 3 seconds after using this skill. You also can get Vulnerability, make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds. You have a 50% chance once we get Fierce Storm Strike. However, after 2 points, go straight into Tornado. Each time you cast Tornado, you have a 20% chance to spawn an additional Tornado with Enhanced Tornado. And then finally, Raging Tornado. Enemies hit with Tornado have a 10% chance to become vulnerable. So we want to get Raging Tornado. We want to get Fierce Storm Strike. We've now unlocked this tier here. Now, one skill that we're going to want to get here, actually, there's multiple. So depending on if you need more damage or if you need more survivability, this is where the build can deviate. Most likely, you're just going to want more damage. So Heart of the Wild Impulses. Core skills cost 15% more spirit, deal 30% more damage. Very, very strong skill right there. However, you do want to get Unstoppable, so Earthen Bulwark, and then Enhanced Earthen Bulwark. That makes it so that it gives you Unstoppable. When you use it, you need to have an Unstoppable skill in your build at all times. If you're CC'd, you can't use potions, and you can absolutely die within CC, so it's very, very strong to do that. Also, Cyclone Armor, super strong, and it's a storm skill. Powerful winds surround you, granting 20% non-physical damage reduction, which is super, super strong. And so that's what I would go with. And then what we have really, really great down here in the companion part is Nature's Reach. Deal 9% increased damage to distant enemies, right? You're gonna be casting tornadoes and stuff. Double this if they're also slowed, stunned, immobilized, or knocked back. So that can also happen as well because of a lot of our abilities are going to slow, as you can see later on. Once we get to the Wrath part of the tree, we get a ton of skills unlocked for us. We've got Hurricane, which deals almost 100% damage over 8 seconds. We've got Enhanced Hurricane. Enemies who are damaged by Hurricane are slowed by 25% for 2 seconds. So there you go. That gives you great synergy with Nature's Reach. Then over here, we've got Natural Hurricane. Hurricane has a 15% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds. So really, really strong Hurricane abilities here. And there's a ton of storm skills here. We're going to get pretty much all of them. So Elemental Exposure, Lucky Hit. Your storm skills have a 20% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds with 3 points. Charged Atmosphere. Every 12 seconds, a lightning strike hits a nearby enemy, dealing 45% damage. So just a passive like lightning storm happening, which is really, really cool. Electric Shock, Lucky Hit, dealing damage. Lightning damage to enemies has a 15% chance to immobilize them for 3 seconds. So there you go. That's going to also help with Nature's Reach if they're slowed, stunned, or immobilized. That gives all of your lightning damage 50% chance to immobilize. And if they're already immobilized, lightning damage dealt is increased by 15%. We've got Bad Omen or Bad Omen. Lucky Hit, up to a 30% chance when dealing damage to a vulnerable, immobilized, or stunned enemy. That lightning strike will also hit, dealing 55% damage. This is huge. We've got so much vulnerability in this build from Storm Strike, from Tornado, Hurricane. All of these add vulnerability. So you have tons of vulnerability. And then Bad Omen is just going to make it so lightning strikes them. And then you got Endless Tempest. Increases the duration of Hurricane and Cataclysm by 15%. You absolutely want that because those two abilities are really, really great for this build. And then finally, we can get Cataclysm. Massive Storm follows you, dealing 52% damage. Increase the duration by 2 seconds. And then Lightning Strikes from Cataclysm make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. Just tons of vulnerability in this build, which is really, really great. And then finally, we can get Perfect Storm. Your storm skills grant 2 spirit and deal 20% increased damage when damaging a vulnerable, immobilized, or slowed enemy. That's pretty much going to be almost always the case. Already you can see here that there is just such a strong number of synergies within the storm build. I would say by default, this build looks super strong already. I would say it's the most refined when it comes to skills. It's just super strong. You do have to go and get Earthen Bulwark for Unstoppable. There is no storm skill that grants Unstoppable. I would also get Vulnerability here with Innate Cyclone Armor. Could also get this, but it's only periodically, so you don't necessarily need it. But super strong. And, honestly, since there's a lot of, bonuses here with Nature's Reach for distant enemies, and this is a melee attack, if you really wanted, you could replace Storm Strike with Wind Shear for just more damage. But Storm Strike is really nice for the damage reduction you also get from it. But overall, this is the build, and it's super strong. And with this in place, let's move on and talk a little bit about aspects you can get. Now, surprisingly, the Storm Druid has has the least number of aspects you can get from dungeons. So Storm Druid is more of a, you kind of have to find certain things. You got to get lucky to complete the build. I would say there's a lot missing from what you can just get with dungeons, but I'm going to show you right here what you can get from dungeons for this particular build that'll help you out. So there's actually nothing that can be found in Fractured Peaks for the Storm Druid. You're going to have to go to Skazglen. So around level 15, when you go there anyways for your spirit boons, I recommend you hit up Mariner's Refuge. This is going to give you Overcharged Aspect, which gives you lucky hit up to a 10% chance when dealing lightning damage to overload the target for 3 seconds, causing any direct damage you deal to them to pulse 350 additional damage to surrounding enemies. Very, very strong. You'll definitely use this in the end game, so it's really great. You can get it right off the bat. I also really like this generic legendary aspect called Aspect of the Expectant. Attacking enemies with basic skills, increase the damage of your next core skill by up to 50%. You can get that in the Underroot in Skazglen. And then in Hawazar actually has a good storm aspect too. Aspect of the Tempest. Hurricane damage is increased by 7% each second while active, which is why we wanted to increase the duration of it. And you can get this in the Blind Burrows in Hawazar. And then in Dry Steppes, there's actually a nice combo of aspects. You've got Aspect of the Calm Breeze, which is lucky hit. Wind Shear has a 5% chance to fully restore your spirit in the Grinning Labyrinth of Dry Steppes. And the next generic aspect, which is Rapid Aspects. Rapid Aspect, basic skills gain plus 23% attack speed. So you can see here, you can just spam Wind Shear with a chance to fully restore your spirit, and you can cast it faster with the Rapid Aspect. Now I would say out of the 3 builds we've gone through, Storm, once again, has the least number of aspects that you can find in dungeons, which means to put this build together to its best potential, you'll have to get lucky and find the other legendary aspects from drops, which they can't be acquired from dungeons. But I do think Storm absolutely has a ton of potential to be one of the strongest Druid endgame builds once you get those drops that are required to finish the build. When it comes to Paragon boards, you want to go for the Thunderstruck Paragon board. Storm skills deal 30% increased critical strike damage against vulnerable or immobilized enemies. They're always going to be vulnerable with all the skills we've chosen. You can also then go towards Constricting Tendrils, which is lucky hit. Nature magic skills have a 15% chance to entangle the enemy with vines, immobilizing them for 2 seconds and poisoning them for 120% of the base damage dealt over 4 seconds. The reason that's really good is because a lot of our bonuses in the Storm Tree are granted from enemies being immobilized or vulnerable. Not always vulnerable though, so immobilized can be very, very helpful as well. I think some of them are like slowed, immobilized, etc. So getting them immobilized from Constricting Tendrils can be very, very good for this build. Okay, let's move on to Spirit Boons. Once again, I think Gift of the Stag is great. For the Deer Spirit Boon, Eagle Spirit Boon, Avian Wrath, 30% increased critical strike damage. When it comes to Snake, you want to get Overload. Lucky hit, dealing lightning damage has a 20% chance to cause the target to deal 20% lightning damage to surrounding enemies. And then Calm Before the Storm, nature skills have a 15% chance to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate skill by 2 seconds. And I really think that Cataclysm is very, very strong, so you want to be able to use that as frequently as possible. And with that, you want to get Calamity with the Wolf Spirit Boon, which extends the duration of ultimate skills by 25%. Going to make Cataclysm even stronger, make it last longer, reduce the cooldown. Very, very good stuff. So that is basically the Storm Druid. What I would say, it has a lot of really strong stuff already baked into the skill tree. Not a lot of legendary aspects that you can find for it, but those are going to have to be found through luck. Is it going to be a great leveling build? Probably, even though you can't find as many legendary aspects. I think it's going to be definitely a much better end game build because it already has so much built into the skill tree. And so you kind of have to get lucky with the drops in order to finish the build. And that's my personal opinion on the Storm Druid. And next up is the Necromancer. Next up, we're going to talk about the Necromancer. We've got 2 awesome builds lined up. We've got a Summoner Necromancer and a Bone Necromancer. Both these builds are insanely strong in very different ways. The Summoner Necromancer is incredibly strong because the minions can be buffed to be so tanky, do so much damage, and there's just so much synergy in the build. It's hard to pick and choose what to even put on your skill bar because everything is so good. And then the Bone Necromancer just has so much burst and crit and damage. It's absolutely insane, and it's pretty much the exact exact opposite, where you actually opt to sacrifice all of your skeletons. And so let's start out by talking a little bit about the Summoner Necromancer. This is one of the builds I am most excited for in Diablo 4 because it's finally a viable summoner build that I believe will actually be good throughout leveling, but also the end game. There's some really good legendary aspects. There's Paragon boards. Let's just dive right into the skills first. So the first primary skill, you get your basic skills, Decompose. This is going to allow you to put a slow on your target with Initiates Decompose. Now the alternative, which seems very, very good, is Acolytes Decompose. You and your minions deal 10% increased damage to enemies that are being decomposed. Now the thing about Decompose is this is a channeled spell on a single target, right? And so it will be very good for, you know, a boss, right, to have that 10% increased damage. But what's even better is getting this slow, and you're going to see a little bit while later, but crowd control effects in Diablo 4 are incredibly powerful because the bonuses that they apply with other combo legendary aspects and skills. And so getting this slow is actually better, and you'll see why later. So we get these three, you know, we get Enhanced Decompose to get more essence, then Initiates Decompose, right? When we move over to the core part of the build, this is a build where I believe skipping out on getting a core skill. So we're not going to get any of them, even though there's plenty of synergy. Like we could get the Supernatural Blight. You and your minions deal 15% increased damage to enemies within Blight, but we simply don't have enough skill slots because we're going to have skeletal skirmishers, skeletal mages, and we're going to have a golem. So that's 3 slots. We just got our basic skill. That is 4. We only have room for 2 more abilities. So keep that in mind. We are going to get Hewed Flesh. Lucky hit. Your damage has a 12% chance to create a corpse at the target's location. This chance is doubled against bosses. We're going to need a constant supply of corpses because we are going to get Corpse Explosion. This is one of the most powerful abilities for the Necromancer. In the beta feedback notes, we saw that this ability was in fact nerfed. It is just so strong. We'll have to see how strong it is after that nerf, but I mean, it doesn't cost any resource. All you need is a corpse. It has no cooldown. Absolutely amazing. Just everything good, right? 105% damage to surrounding enemies. We're going to go ahead and get Enhanced Corpse Explosion, which increases the radius by 15%. And then we're going to get Blighted Corpse Explosion. Corpse Explosion becomes a darkness skill. That's super important. And instead of exploding, it releases a vile miasma dealing 109.8% shadow damage over 6 seconds. So that shadow damage is going to be key for putting the whole build together. We're going to get a bunch of skill passives that work with shadow damage. It's going to be really, really cool. So we're going to get that, and then we're going to get Grim Harvest. Consuming a corpse generates 9 essence, which is cool. And then we're going to get Fueled by Death. You deal 12% increased damage for 4 seconds after consuming a corpse. You're going to be constantly consuming corpses, and so this is going to constantly be giving you 12% increased damage. That's awesome. And of course, because we're going a summoner build, we are going to get Skeletal Warrior Mastery, increasing the damage and life of your skeletal warriors by 45%. That's a big number. Moving over to the corruption part of the tree, we're going to put 3 points into Death's Reach. You deal 12% increased damage to distant enemies. Pretty much always going to be distant because we have no melee abilities. We're going to put 3 points into Skeletal Mage Mastery, increase the damage and life of all your skeletal mages by 45%. Perfect. And then summoning, we're going to get 3 points into Reaper's Pursuit, damaging enemies with darkness skills, which is both our primary skill and Corpse Explosion. This is going to give you 15% increased move speed for 3 seconds, but it's going to basically be always on as you fight enemies. 3 points into Crippling Darkness. This is a very big and very important passive skill. Lucky hit. Darkness skills have a 15% chance to stun for 3 seconds. Tons of synergies when enemies are stunned, as you will see. Terror. Darkness skills deal 9% bonus damage to enemies who are slowed and 9% bonus to enemies that are stunned or immobilized. They stack and apply to shadow damage dealt by your minions. So we're going to see later as we start going through the Book of the Dead about how we can make our minions do shadow damage so that they get that increased damage. So this is 18% if they are slowed and stunned. 18% increased damage, quite a bit. We got Gloom. When you damage enemies with darkness skills, they take 6% increased shadow damage from you and your minions for 2 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. That's another 18% increased damage. Just these two together is 36% increased damage. So that's huge damage bonuses. Now this is actually probably one of my favorite parts of the build. Army of the Dead. This ability is it's good, right? And we get this enhancement when Army of the Dead volatile skeletons explode. They have a 15% chance to leave behind a corpse. This is perfect because we use Corpse Explosion. Specialization. Now, one of the things about Diablo 4 Necromancer, unlike Diablo 3 and very similar to Diablo 2, is you have to summon your Necromancer skeletons every single time, right? You got to summon your skeletal mages, got to summon your skeletal warriors. You start the game, you have no summons, right? And so what's great about this ultimate is that this right here, Supreme Army of the Dead, also raises your skeletal warriors and skeletal mages. I love this ability. Basically, you just log on for the day. You don't want to go have to, like, how are you supposed to even kill those first mobs? All you got is your golem or whatever. Well, just pop your ultimate right on the first pack of monsters and you've got all of your summons instantly summoned. This is just so cool. Supreme Army of the Dead is a keystone ability for this build, and of course is our final skill that really just puts the build together. I love it. And there's a bunch of bonuses we can put together with this that we're going to go through. We're also going to get Golem Mastery, increases the damage and life of your golem by 45%. So over here we have Inspiring Leader. After you've been healthy for at least 4 seconds, that means over 85% health. You and your minions gain 12% attack speed. That's sweet. Hellbent Commander. Your minions deal 30% increased damage while you are close to them. That's actually within melee range of them. Bonded in Essence. Every 5 seconds, your skeletal priest's healing will heal your skeletons for 40% of their maximum life. That is awesome. Then we got Death's Defense. Your minions cannot lose more than 25% of their maximum life from a single damage instance. Very good against very dangerous bosses like, I don't know, the Butcher, or I don't know, just bosses basically in general. World bosses that'll do a ton of damage will keep your minions alive during that fight. All right, and then finally we're going to go ahead and get Shadow Blight. This completes the Shadow build. Shadow damage infects enemies, and you and your minions deal 10% bonus damage to enemies with Shadow Blight. So anytime you deal shadow damage, the target's going to take 10% increased damage from you and your minions, which is awesome. And then every 10th time an enemy receives shadow damage from you or your minions while they have Shadow Blight, they take an additional 20% shadow damage. And again, some of your minions can actually do shadow damage as well, but you're going to get 10% all damage and then an additional 20% shadow damage. I think this is better than Kalen's Edict because this is 15% attack speed. It goes up to 30% attack speed, but it's if you have not taken damage, which I believe you're going to be taking damage inevitably, and so you won't always have this. This you will always have 10% damage increase always. So I think it's better. So those are the skills, and let's go on over to the legendary aspects. Now I do want to say a disclaimer here. Remember, this is a leveling build. We're not going to have the best in slot legendary aspects for the build. I'll make a video for that in the future, so don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on that one. But we're going to talk about the legendary aspects you can get from dungeons, which are guaranteed 100% of the time. They go into your Codex of Power, and you can use them over and over on your gear while you level so that you can keep those aspects. Whereas if you found an aspect on an item, you can only imprint that, once. And so then it's gone once you want to upgrade your weapon again. So, or whatever piece of gear. So these are aspects you can keep with you forever. I'm going to show you what they are and where you can get them. Let's start with the offensive ones. So we got Unyielding Commander's Aspect. While Army of the Dead is active, your minions gain 70% attack speed and take 90% reduced damage. Basically, it's buffing your ultimate. You can find this in the Faceless Shrine in Hawazar. Awesome. Edgemaster's Aspect. Skills deal up to 24% increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast, receiving the maximum benefit while you have full primary resource, unlocked by completing Old Stones in Skazglen. I love this ability because we're not going to, or this aspect, because we're not getting a core skill. We're always going to have max primary resource. So that is a 24% increased damage always with our Corpse Explosion, with our Army of the Dead. It's awesome. Even our primary skill or our basic skill is going to get that increased damage because we're always going to be full on primary resource. So flat 24% increased damage aspect. Amazing. We're also going to get Aspect of Retribution. Distant enemies have a 15% chance to be stunned for 2 seconds when they hit you, and you deal 30% increased damage to stunned enemies. If you remember, we have Lucky Hit. Your darkness skills have a 15% chance to stun enemies for 3 seconds. So when they get stunned, you're going to deal 30% increased damage to them. So that is awesome. And then while we're on that topic of stuns, we have to look at Aspect of Shared Misery. When you hit a crowd controlled enemy, there's a 30% chance for that crowd control effect to spread to another unaffected enemy. And you can find this in Oblivion in Hawazar. So let's say you stun an enemy with a darkness skill that has a chance to spread to another unaffected enemy. And you're doing tons of AoE with Corpse Explosion. And so basically your slows, your stuns, this is all going to just spread across enemies as you use your Corpse Explosion ability, thanks to Aspect of Shared Misery. Very, very awesome interaction there. We're also going to get Aspect of Reanimation. Now, this is not one you can find in dungeons. I just included it here because there's actually only a limited amount of things that fit this build that you can find in dungeons, but this is one you can go get later. Your skeletons gain increased damage while alive, up to 20% after 10 seconds. All right, let's talk about hulking aspect. This is a resource generic aspect. Your golem has a 10% chance to reduce its active cooldown by 2 seconds and a 5% chance to spawn a corpse each time it damages an enemy with its normal attack. Great, we need those corpses, and awesome because it does an AoE drain life. We're going to go with the blood golem. I think it's the best one. And so you want to be able to use that more often. Unlocked by completing Sepulture of the Forsworn in Kyrgyzstan. Awesome, awesome, awesome. All right, so next let's talk about eluding aspect. This is just a defensive. Now, one thing that I almost never do in any of the builds I make is I always have an unstoppable skill. Unfortunately, this just doesn't have room for it. You know, I would get Blood Mist because it's so strong and every Necromancer build should have it, but there's just no room in this build. We've got the 3 summons, we've got the Golem, we've got the Skeletal Warriors, the Skeletal Mages, that's 3 skills. We've got our basic skill, and we've got Corpse Explosion and our ultimate, and so those are the 6 slots, and so there's just no room for an unstoppable skill. Well, eluding aspect gives you unstoppable when you become injured while crowd controlled. This is going to help you basically escape death by making you unstoppable, and you can use your potion, get out of there, etc. You can get this from Caldera Gate in Fractured Peaks. Along those same lines, protecting aspect. When hit while not healthy, a magical bubble is summoned around you for 3 seconds and you'll become immune. This is good because basically you don't really need to move much as a summoner. You can kind of just hang out in that bubble the whole time. I think it's strong for this particular build. And then finally we have Aspect of Might. Basic skills grant 25% damage reduction for 4 seconds. I think almost every build should have this. 25% damage reduction is huge. You can find this by completing the Dark Ravine in Dry Steppes. And that, I believe, is every single legendary aspect for this build. Very, very cool. Okay, now that we've talked about legendary aspects, let's talk about the Book of the Dead. Now this is very, very fun and cool. I love the Book of the Dead. And we're going to start off with the Skeletal Skirmishers. We're going to try to just get 1 additional Skeletal Skirmisher. The reason for that is because we've specialized in making our Skeletal Warriors stronger. And so having an extra one, basically stretching that bonus, increasing the effectiveness of the skill points we put into that. We're also going to get a Shadow Mage, and the reason we're going to get Shadow Mages is because they do shadow damage, and there's tons of synergy when our minions deal shadow damage. We've got shadow damage bonuses. The build is using tons of shadow damage, and we're also going to get the specialize in the fact that Shadow Mages will fire an additional Shadow Bolt every 6th attack, and that's important because we want even more shadow damage. So I think that's the better option there. And then finally, for our Golem, we're going to get Blood Golem. I think it's the most powerful Golem. It drains life in an AoE, but more importantly, your Golem absorbs 15% of the damage you would take. This is a passive 15% damage reduction. I just think it's the most powerful Golem specialization you could possibly choose, so highly recommend that one. And that's the Book of the Dead. Moving on, we to the Paragon board. This is your starter Paragon board, and I recommend after that you go head to the Cult Leader Legendary node. Your minions deal 10% increased damage for each minion type you have active. That's 30% because it only applies to Skeletal Warrior, Skeletal Mage, and Golem. So you and your minions, or sorry, that's just your minions deal 30% increased damage. So awesome. Perfect for the summoning build. And then we're going to also get Hulking Monstrosity. Your Golem has 30% increased maximum life and deals 30% increased damage. The maximum life helps because that will keep it alive as it takes your damage, and the increased damage will help with keeping itself alive as well because that AoE drain life it has. And of course just dealing more damage. So very, very cool. Those are the 2 Paragon boards, and that is the Necromancer Summoner build for leveling. Again, endgame, you are probably going to switch up some of the legendary aspects, but those are the ones you can find in dungeons guaranteed every single time. And with all that said, let's move on and talk